Ever had that moment when you're mowing your own lawn on a Saturday morning and suddenly hear the crunch of tires on your driveway? Not just any tires, those distinctive white SUVs with the HOA logo emblazoned on the side. What they didn't know was that I'm not just another homeowner who'll back down when confronted. I'm the chief of police for the city they're trying to police. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because what you're about to hear isn't just another HOA horror story. It's a masterclass in how authority works when the people enforcing the rules don't understand who actually has authority. My name's Robert Hayes, and I've been in law enforcement for 28 years, 18 of them as chief of police for the city of Oakwood. For the past 12 years, I've lived in the Willow Creek neighborhood, a quiet community where I thought I could enjoy my career while raising my family in peace. I bought my home not as an investment, but as a place where I could decompress from the high-stakes world of police work and actually live the community values I've spent my career protecting. When I first moved here, I didn't think much about the HOA. Most communities have them, and I figured it was just the usual nonsense about lawn height and mailbox styles. What I didn't realize was that Willow Creek Estates wasn't your average homeowners association. It was run by a woman named Diane "Di" Peterson, who had turned HOA management into a full-time career and a highly profitable one at that. Di wasn't your typical HOA president. She wasn't some bored retiree looking for a hobby. She was a former real estate agent who'd seen the golden goose of HOA management and decided to cash in. She drove a white Lexus SUV with custom HOA patrol decals, wore designer business casual that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and had that particular brand of suburban entitlement that makes you want to check your credentials when she smiles at you. Di's specialty was what she called community standards enforcement, which was really just a fancy way of saying she'd find any excuse to expand the HOA's territory, increase dues, and fine homeowners for the most ridiculous violations. She'd find a family $500 for having a basketball hoop that detracted from neighborhood aesthetics. She'd threatened to put a lien on a veteran's home because his American flag was slightly faded. One homeowner was charged $800 for excessive noise after his daughter's 8th birthday party. Never mind that the party ended at 7 p.m. on a Saturday. What made Di particularly dangerous was that she'd married well. Her husband, Thomas Peterson, was a city councilman with significant influence over local ordinances. This meant that when Di decided to push through questionable enforcement policies, she had someone in the council chambers making sure they happened quickly and quietly. Their power couple status made them virtually untouchable in our community, until they messed with the wrong person. I first noticed something was wrong about 8 months ago. I was coming home from a long shift at the precinct when I noticed a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. It was a violation notice from the HOA, claiming I'd failed to maintain proper lawn height and allowed excessive leaf accumulation in my front yard. Now, I've been a police officer for nearly 3 decades. I've dealt with everything from domestic disputes to armed robberies. But I'd never had someone try to tell me how to maintain my own property. The notice was absurd. My lawn was cut to a reasonable height, and the leaf accumulation was a few stray leaves from the oak tree in my front yard. It was early October, for heaven's sake. Leaves fall in autumn. I called the HOA office and spoke with Di directly. "Diane," I said politely, "I believe there's been a mistake with the violation notice on my property." "Oh, Chief Hayes," she replied with that syrupy voice she reserves for when she knows she's in the wrong but thinks she can talk her way out of it. "We're just enforcing the community standards that all homeowners agreed to when they moved in." "I understand that," I said, "but the notice appears to be in error. My lawn is well within the specified height, and the leaves are minimal." Di's tone changed immediately. Chief Hayes, I appreciate your position, but the HOA has its own rules that supersede personal opinions. You'll need to address the violations within 7 days or face fines. I hung up the phone, realizing this wasn't going to be resolved through polite conversation. Di operated on the assumption that most people would rather pay the fine or walk away than fight back. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Most people in my position would have panicked. They would have hired an expensive lawyer and prepared for a long, drawn-out legal battle. A quick search through public records revealed that her previous HOA in another city had paid a $950,000 settlement after a similar pattern of harassment was exposed. This wasn't just about my lawn. This was about stopping a pattern of behavior that had been hurting people for years. Di wasn't just a bully, she was a repeat offender who had learned that most people would rather pay the fine or walk away than fight back. The morning after the HOA meeting, I received a letter from Di's attorney. It was a cease and desist order demanding that I stop harassing HOA members and spreading false information about the community. It also threatened legal action if I didn't immediately stop my campaign of misinformation. The letter was full of legal jargon designed to intimidate, but it was completely baseless, the kind of thing Di's attorney knew would scare most people into silence. Most people would have backed down at this point, but I wasn't most people. I'm a police chief who spent his career working to protect the rule of law. I know that authority isn't something you can just claim, it's something you earn through proper procedure and respect for the law. I called Maria again. What happens, I asked, if I file a formal complaint with the city council about Di's misuse of city resources? Maria was quiet for a moment. In that case, she said, the city manager would have to investigate, but it takes time, usually weeks, sometimes months. I knew what she was implying. If Di continued her harassment campaign, it could cause significant damage to homeowners before the city could respond. But there was another option. As chief of police, I had the authority to address certain violations of city ordinances. If Di was violating city codes in her enforcement practices, I could address those directly. I spent the next 24 hours studying the city's municipal code. It was clear. HOAs cannot enter private property without permission except in cases of emergency. They cannot use city resources for private enforcement purposes. They cannot threaten homeowners with legal action for exercising their rights to free speech at board meetings. This was it. This was my leverage. I filed an amended complaint with the city clerk's office, specifically highlighting Di's misuse of police dispatch information and unauthorized entry onto private property. I also contacted the city manager and explained the situation, emphasizing the risk to homeowners' privacy and rights. By noon the next day, I had confirmation that the city manager would conduct an investigation into Di's practices. Di couldn't ignore this kind of official attention. Di didn't take this news well. That afternoon, she showed up at my door with 2 HOA board members in tow. Chief Hayes, she said, her voice dripping with false concern, I'm worried about you. You've been acting so erratically lately. I smiled. That's funny, Diane. I was just about to suggest the same thing to you. You know, after the city manager's investigation starts tomorrow morning, you might want to start thinking about your legal liability for those unauthorized entries. Her face went pale. You wouldn't dare. I already did, I said. The investigation is scheduled to begin tomorrow. I suggest you have your attorney there. As she turned to leave, she muttered, You should have stayed closer to home, Chief. I called after her. Funny you should say that, because I've been in law enforcement for 28 years and I know exactly what happens when you abuse your authority. The next morning, the city manager's investigation confirmed everything I'd suspected. Di had been accessing police dispatch logs without authorization. She'd been entering private property without permission. She'd been threatening homeowners with legal action for speaking out at board meetings. This was it. This was my leverage. I filed an amended complaint with the city clerk's office, specifically highlighting Dai's misuse of police dispatch information and unauthorized entry onto private property. I also contacted the city manager and explained the situation, emphasizing the risk to homeowners' privacy and rights. By noon the next day, I had confirmation that the city manager would conduct an investigation into Dai's practices. Dai couldn't ignore this kind of official attention. Dai didn't take this news well. That afternoon, she showed up at my door with 2 HOA board members in tow. "Chief Hayes," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I'm worried about you. You've been acting so erratically lately. Maybe you should take some time to focus on your mental health." I smiled. "That's funny, Diane. I was just about to suggest the same thing to you. You know, after the city manager's investigation starts tomorrow morning, you might want to start thinking about your legal liability for those unauthorized entries." Her face went pale. "You wouldn't dare." "I already did," I said. "The investigation is scheduled to begin tomorrow. I suggest you have your attorney there." As she turned to leave, she muttered, "You should have stayed closer to home, Chief." I called after her. "Funny you should say that, because I've been in law enforcement for 28 years and I know exactly what happens when you abuse your authority." The next morning, the city manager's investigation confirmed everything I'd suspected. Dai had been accessing police dispatch logs without authorization. She'd been entering private property without permission. She'd been threatening homeowners with legal action for speaking out at board meetings. The city manager issued a formal warning and ordered her to cease all unauthorized activities immediately. Dai was apoplectic. She demanded to speak to the mayor, threatened to sue the city manager, and even tried to bribe city staff with offers of future cooperation. None of it worked. The city staff were professionals who had seen this kind of behavior before. That afternoon, I received another call from Dai's attorney. This time, it wasn't a cease and desist order. It was a settlement offer, $150,000 to go away and not pursue further action against the HOA. I declined. 2 days later, with the city manager's warning still fresh and no sign that Dai was going to comply with the city's orders, I did something that would change everything. I filed a motion with the city council requesting an emergency hearing to address the ongoing violations of city ordinances by the HOA. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning, the same morning as Dai's daughter's wedding. I knew what I was doing. But I also knew that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stand your ground and force them to face the consequences of their actions. The city council chambers were packed the next morning, not just with lawyers and officials, but with homeowners from the community, people who had been silenced by Dai's tyranny for years, but were now ready to speak up. There was Mr. Jenkins, who had kept detailed records of every time Dai had violated his privacy. There was Sarah Mitchell, who had photographs of her cultural shrine before Dai had forced her to remove it. There was even the retired judge, who had brought a file of legal precedents showing how Dai had repeatedly overstepped her authority. Dai arrived with her usual entourage, her husband Thomas, 2 high-priced attorneys, and a team of experts who were clearly on her payroll. She was wearing a designer dress and pearls, looking every bit the concerned community leader. But her eyes kept darting around the room, clearly unnerved by the number of people who had shown up to support me. I showed up in my uniform, the same one I wear when I'm out in the field protecting the community. Sometimes the best armor is just being comfortable in your own skin. The council president, a no-nonsense woman named Councilwoman Eleanor Hayes, who had heard hundreds of community disputes in her career, wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "Chief Hayes," she said, "you've alleged that the Willow Creek HOA has been violating city ordinances through unauthorized entry onto private property and misuse of city resources. What evidence do you have to support this claim?" I stood up and presented my case methodically. Security footage of Dai entering private property without permission. documentation of Dai's unauthorized access to police dispatch logs, testimonies from affected homeowners, copies of the city's municipal code showing the violations, evidence of Dai's previous violations in another city, time-stamped logs of all interactions with the HOA, legal opinions from the city attorney's office. Councilwoman Hayes reviewed the evidence carefully, her expression growing more serious with each document she examined. Then she turned to Dai's attorney. "And what does the HOA have to say about these allegations?" The attorney stood up and launched into a well-rehearsed speech about how the HOA was necessary for community safety, and how I was misrepresenting the facts to serve my own agenda. He presented photos of the community, calling it a beautiful addition to the city that provided recreational opportunities for residents. He even produced a letter from a community standards expert who claimed the HO's practices were completely legal. Councilwoman Hayes listened patiently, then asked a simple question. Is the HOA in compliance with the city manager's warning? The attorney hesitated. "Well, Councilwoman, we're working on a solution, but are you in compliance or not?" Councilwoman Hayes interrupted. "No, Councilwoman," the attorney admitted. "Then why haven't you ceased the unauthorized activities as ordered?" The attorney launched into a complicated explanation about permits, enforcement challenges, and community concerns. Councilwoman Hayes cut him off. "Let me be clear," she said. "This council will not tolerate willful violation of city ordinances, especially when those violations create an imminent risk to homeowners' rights and privacy. The city manager has determined that these practices must cease immediately. If that doesn't happen, I will recommend that the city attorney pursue legal action against the HOA and its officers." She turned to me. "Chief Hayes, is there anything else you'd like to add?" I stood up and said simply, "Councilwoman, this isn't just about HOA violations. It's about respecting the rule of law. Homeowners have the right to privacy on their own property. They have the right to speak freely at board meetings without fear of retaliation. What the HOA has done isn't just illegal, it's disrespectful of the community it's supposed to serve. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the law to be enforced, as it should be for everyone." Councilwoman Hayes nodded. "The council agrees. The city manager's warning stands. The HOA must cease all unauthorized activities immediately. Failure to do so will result in legal action and potential personal liability for the HOA's officers." She turned to me. "Chief Hayes, is there anything else you'd like to add?" I stood up and said simply, "Councilwoman, this isn't just about HOA violations. It's about respecting the rule of law. Homeowners have the right to privacy on their own property. They have the right to speak freely at board meetings without fear of retaliation. What the HOA has done isn't just illegal, it's disrespectful of the community it's supposed to serve. I'm not asking for special treatment, I'm asking for the law to be enforced, as it should be for everyone." Councilwoman Hayes nodded. "The council agrees. The city manager's warning stands. The HOA must cease all unauthorized activities immediately. Failure to do so will result in legal action and potential personal liability for the HOA's officers." As we left the council chambers, Dai approached me, her face red with anger. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. "My daughter's wedding is today, and now this!" I looked at her calmly. "You made your choices, Diane. You decided to abuse your position and violate homeowners' rights. The consequences are on you, not me." That afternoon, as predicted, Dai decided to make one last stand. She called the police department, claiming there was a disturbance at my property. She specifically requested that officers respond immediately to address the threat to community safety. What she didn't know was that I was still at the precinct, having stayed late to review some case files. When the dispatch call came through, I heard it over the radio. "Unit 45, respond to 123 Oak Street for a disturbance. Caller reports a suspicious individual on the property." I picked up the radio. Dispatch, this is the chief. I'm currently at 123 Oak Street. What's the nature of the disturbance? There was a moment of silence. Chief, we have a call from the HOA reporting a disturbance at your residence. Understood, I said. I'll handle it from here. I walked out to my car, fully aware that Di was watching from across the street. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw her standing there with her phone to her ear, clearly expecting to see officers confront me. Instead, she saw me get out of my vehicle, still in uniform, and walk toward her. "Chief Hayes," she stammered, I didn't realize you were home." "I am," I said calmly, "and I understand you called the police about a disturbance at my property." Di's face went white. I thought there was a problem." "Let me ask you something, Diane," I said, keeping my voice professional. "Do you know what the penalty is for filing a false police report?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "It's a misdemeanor offense, punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine," I said. "And since I'm the chief of police, I'd be the one processing that charge." Di started to back away. I didn't mean to." "You need to understand something," I interrupted. "The police department exists to protect the community, not to enforce HOA rules. When you call us for non-emergencies, you're wasting resources that could be used to respond to actual emergencies. And when you call us specifically to target a homeowner because you have a personal vendetta, that crosses the line into abuse of the system." I could see the realization dawning on her face. She had called the police, not realizing she was calling on the chief of police himself. The tables had turned completely. "From now on," I continued, "if you have a concern about a homeowner, you address it through the proper HOA channels. If there's an actual emergency that requires police involvement, you call 911 like everyone else. But if I find out you've been using the police department to enforce HOA rules again, I will personally file charges against you for misuse of emergency services." Di nodded, unable to meet my eyes. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The city immediately launched a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. The city attorney filed civil charges against Di and the HOA for misuse of city resources. The homeowners who had been targeted filed a class action lawsuit seeking damages. But the most significant development came 2 days later when the state attorney general announced a criminal investigation into potential fraud and corruption related to the HOA's enforcement practices. Di tried to spin the narrative, of course. She told the local news that the investigation was political retaliation and that I was exaggerating the situation to serve my own agenda. But the evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showed her entering private property without permission. City records confirmed her unauthorized access to dispatch logs. And multiple witnesses testified about her pattern of abusive behavior. Within a week, Di had resigned as HOA president. Within a month, she and her husband were facing multiple civil and criminal charges. Within 3 months, the HOA had dissolved completely, replaced by a new homeowners association run by actual homeowners, not power-hungry bureaucrats. The best part? The community is finally starting to heal from years of Di's tyranny. Homeowners feel safe in their own yards again. Board meetings are productive discussions rather than fear-filled spectacles. And for the first time in years, people are actually enjoying living in Willow Creek Estates. But here's what most people don't realize about situations like this. They're not really about lawn height or mailbox styles or even HOAs. They're about respect. Respect for the law, respect for your neighbors, respect for the boundaries between private organizations and public authority. If you're dealing with an HOA that's overstepping its bounds, here's what you need to do. 1. Know your rights. Get a copy of your property deed and the original development documents. 2. Document everything. Keep detailed records of all interactions and violations. 3. Build alliances. Find other affected homeowners who are willing to stand with you. 4. Go to the authorities. File formal complaints with the appropriate regulatory agencies. 5. Stay calm and professional. Don't let anger cloud your judgment or your strategy. Most HOAs rely on the fact that people don't know their rights and won't fight back. But when you do know your rights and you do fight back, properly and strategically, you'll find that their power evaporates faster than morning dew in the sun. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that Di and her cronies couldn't keep taking advantage of people who didn't know better. And it worked. Not with threats or intimidation, just with knowledge, preparation, and the patience to follow the process. Let me share something I discovered during this process that most people never consider. HOAs operate on the assumption that 95% of homeowners will never read the governing documents. They count on the fact that most people don't know the difference between covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, and the actual development documents that establish the HOA's legal boundaries. When I was reviewing the HOA's financial records during the investigation, I found something astonishing. They had been charging special assessments for projects that had never been approved by the membership. They'd been holding secret meetings where they made decisions that should have required a formal vote. They'd been using funds designated for landscaping to pay for Di's community relations trips to conferences. The most brazen violation was how they handled the Architectural Review Committee. They'd created a system where any homeowner who questioned an HOA decision would automatically be flagged for special scrutiny on any future renovation requests. It was a textbook case of retaliation, something that's explicitly prohibited under state law. What really opened my eyes was seeing how the HOA's financial records had been manipulated. They'd created a complex system of shell companies and fake invoices to siphon off money. One company, called Community Standards Enforcement, had billed the HOA over $75,000 in the past year. But when I checked with the Secretary of State's office, I discovered that the company didn't actually exist. It was just a P.O. box and a bank account controlled by Di's husband. This kind of financial manipulation is more common than you'd think. A 2022 study by the Community Associations Institute found that nearly 30% of HOAs have some form of financial irregularity, but less than 5% ever face consequences because homeowners don't know what to look for. I want to emphasize something important. This wasn't just about me winning my case. It was about creating a template that other homeowners could follow. After the council ruling, I created a simple checklist for homeowners who suspect their HOA might be overstepping its bounds. I shared it with the other affected homeowners, and within weeks, 3 of them had successfully gotten their dues refunded. Here's what that checklist looks like. 1. Verify your property's inclusion in the HOA. Obtain a copy of your property deed. Get the original development documents from county records. Compare the boundaries in both documents. If they don't match, you may have been improperly included. 2. Review the HOA's governing documents. Request copies of the CC&Rs, bylaws, and articles of incorporation. Check for proper amendment procedures. Verify that all changes were properly approved. Look for clauses that might have expired. 3. Examine financial records. Request the past 3 years of financial statements. Check for unusual expenses or vendors. Verify that special assessments were properly authorized. Look for patterns of late fees or penalties. 4. Document everything. Keep copies of all communications. Note dates, times, and names of people you speak with. Take photos of any violations you observe. Maintain a detailed timeline of events. 5. Know your state's laws. Research your state's HOA regulations. Understand your rights as a homeowner. Find out which agency oversees HOAs in your state. Learn about the complaint process. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require legal expertise. It's about systematic documentation and understanding the rules that govern these organizations. Most HOAs collapse under scrutiny because they're built on a foundation of assumptions. Assumptions that homeowners won't read the documents, won't ask questions, and won't stand up for their rights. I received a message last week from a man in Charlotte who used my checklist to challenge his HOA. They'd been charging him $250 a month for community standards enforcement on a property that was explicitly excluded from the HOA in the original development documents. He followed the steps, filed a complaint with the appropriate agency, and within 2 months, he'd gotten 2 years of dues refunded and the HOA was under investigation. That's the power of knowledge. That's why I'm sharing this story with you today. One thing I want to address directly is the fear factor. Most people are afraid to challenge their HOA because they're worried about retaliation, higher dues, more fines, or even a lawsuit. I get it. When Di first showed up at my door, I felt that same knot in my stomach. But here's what most people don't realize. HOAs are incredibly risk-averse. They're made up of homeowners just like you, and they don't want negative publicity or legal trouble any more than you do. When you approach the situation with documented facts and a clear understanding of the law, you shift the power dynamic. Suddenly, it's not about whether you can afford a lawyer, it's about whether the HOA can afford the negative attention and potential legal consequences of continuing their improper practices. Another common misconception is that you need a lawyer to challenge an HOA. In many cases, you don't. Most states have laws that require HOAs to make their governing documents available to homeowners. The agency that oversees HOAs in your state often provides free resources and guidance. Let me share a story that illustrates this point. After my case was settled, I got a call from a neighbor who had been living in Willow Creek Estates for 15 years. She told me that for the past 10 years, she'd been paying $125 a month in HOA dues, believing it was mandatory. When she checked her deed after hearing about my case, she discovered that her property was also explicitly excluded from the HOA. She went to the HOA board meeting and calmly presented her documentation. The board chairman tried to intimidate her, but she stood her ground and cited the specific state statute that protected her rights. Within a week, she'd gotten all her dues refunded going back 10 years. That's over $15,000. That's the power of knowing your rights. I want to address something else that's important, the emotional toll of these battles. When Di first started harassing me, I'll admit I felt isolated. I wondered if I was the only one who saw what was happening. I questioned whether I was overreacting. That's exactly what HOAs count on. They create an environment where questioning authority feels like being a bad neighbor. But here's the truth. Standing up for your rights doesn't make you a bad neighbor. It makes you a responsible community member. A community where people are afraid to question authority isn't a healthy community. It's a community ripe for abuse. When I was preparing for the council hearing, I made a conscious decision not to let anger drive my strategy. Anger makes you sloppy. It makes you emotional. It makes you lose sight of your objectives. Instead, I focused on the facts, the documentation, and the law. I treated the whole process like I would treat a criminal investigation, systematically identifying vulnerabilities and addressing them one by one. This approach served me well in the council chambers. While Di's attorney was making dramatic gestures and using emotional language, I was calmly presenting my evidence, citing specific statutes, and letting the facts speak for themselves. The council responded to that professionalism. Here's something else I learned that might surprise you. Most HOA board members aren't bad people. They're often well-meaning homeowners who've been misled by previous boards or by HOA management companies. The real problem is usually the small group of power-hungry individuals who dominate the board and set the tone for everyone else. In my case, Di was the driving force behind the improper enforcement practices. The other board members were just going along with it because they trusted her. When the evidence came out in the council chambers, several of them looked genuinely shocked. One even approached me afterward to apologize. That's why I always recommend starting with a conversation, not a confrontation. Go to an HOA meeting, ask questions about the governing documents, and request copies of anything you're unsure about. Most of the time, the issue can be resolved with a simple clarification. It's only when you're met with resistance or evasion that you need to escalate. I've heard from dozens of viewers since I started sharing stories like this, and the pattern is always the same. Someone challenges their HOA with documented facts and a clear understanding of the law, and the HOA backs down immediately. They don't want the scrutiny, they don't want the paperwork, they certainly don't want the potential legal consequences. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. It was about making sure that Di and her cronies couldn't keep taking advantage of people who didn't know better. And it worked. Not with threats or intimidation, just with knowledge, preparation, and the patience to follow the process. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and tell me your HOA story. I read every single one. If you're dealing with an HOA that's overstepping its bounds, I'll give you the same advice I'd give a friend. Don't panic. Get the documents, know the law, and fight smart. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about taking on bureaucratic bullies and winning. Next week, I'm telling you about the time I took down a corrupt property management company by finding a single missing comma in their contract. That's a story about how the smallest details can bring down the biggest empires. Your voice matters. Your vote matters. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say no more to change everything. Willow Creek Estates is peaceful again, y'all, and it always will be.